Hi, welcome to Culture and Causation. I'm Aaron Briley, and my guest today is Nick Pilgrim. Now, Mr. Pilgrim graduated summa cum laude from Hobart College with a degree in economics. He then graduated with honors from the University of Chicago Law School. He's a trial attorney and a former federal prosecutor with over 15 years of litigation experience. Now, Mr. Pilgrim is here today to discuss his compelling book, Black Culture Matters: Why It's Time to Stop Pretending Racism is the Problem. So I'm really excited to speak to this guest today, and I just can't wait to get started. Nick, welcome to the show.
Hey, Aaron, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. Now, so we're here to discuss your book, and I just first want to start off by saying that I found this book very compelling because I thought you made, very interesting and thoughtful comments, or actually thoughtful observations about the plight of inner city Black America. And you also offered some constructive measures to alleviate these problems. So I thought it was great because you looked at the problems and you tried to propose some solutions, which I often don't find. So before we dive deep into the specifics, I'd love to start with the core message of the book, like the core, sort of the thesis of the book. So I want to read a quote to you and then get your response, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay, great. So this is from your book, Black Culture Matters, page 12. Quote, "Significantly, Blacks are still fighting the same old battles without meaningfully advancing because for the last 4+ decades, we have been fixated on the wrong enemy. Racism and white supremacy are not primarily responsible for why Blacks continue to perform much worse than every other group in America. Black culture is. To change this, Black men and women will have to acknowledge that Black culture matters rather than always pretending that white supremacy is holding us back," unquote. So my question then to you is, can you explain what that means? And is that the thesis of the book?
Sure. I think that is at least one of the thesis of the book. And it's based on a lot of research that I've conducted over the years and in my own firsthand experiences. Just by way of background, even as a child, I was, watching videos about the civil rights movement and steeped in the history of our people, African Americans, and our struggle for equality in the United States. And, through the research and the analysis that I've done, it became obvious that we haven't moved forward as a people as much as we would like. And in order to analyze why that's happening, we have to move beyond the rhetoric, the commonplace rhetoric of racism or systemic racism or institutional racism, to actually focus on what are the driving factors, the driving forces that explain why inequality continues to be a problem. And in some respects is increasing, in terms of the income gap, for example, or the wealth gap. We see either stagnation or increases in the racial gaps. And so when I did this analysis and compared our plight to the situation of other minority groups, including African immigrants, it became clear that one of the driving factors distinguishing ourselves from other groups is the behaviors and our performance. And sad to say, in many areas of life, our performance and our behaviors aren't at the same level as other groups. And by the way, Aaron, this isn't anything new that I'm observing. I mean, Dr. King talked about the same thing in the 1950s and the 1960s, but tragically, the same problems exist. And so why is that the case? And the hard answer, Aaron, is that culture has a lot to do with it. Culture drives behavior. And you're looking at a culture that unfortunately has been affected adversely by past events in history. And because of the way our unique history has shaped us, there are certain mindsets and behaviors that are detrimental to progress. And those behaviors, I argue in my book, are fundamentally responsible for why inequality persists today, more so than vague, nebulous concepts like structural racism. And so that is the thesis of the book. We have to come to terms with the cultural issues that are causing us to behave in different ways than other groups and to perform differently than other groups, for example, in the classroom.
Great. Well, I was going to ask you that. That was a great, I guess, synopsis of what the book is about. And it also leads me to my next question, because in the title of the book, you know, the title is Black Culture Matters, and the subtitle is Why It's Time to Stop Pretending Racism is the Problem. So I wanted to focus on the problem. What actually is the problem that you're referring to in the Black community, and why should we focus on them? I think you mentioned something earlier, maybe I think it was education. Are there any other problems that you see worth focusing on?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big problem from a global perspective is inequality, specifically racial inequality. Why, for example, do Black people on average continue to make less money than not just whites, but Hispanics and Asians and virtually all other groups? Why academically do Blacks on average perform worse than other groups? You know, and a host of other facts, you know, for example, the arrest rates and the homicide rates. They're just a wide spectrum of social economic factors where African Americans are performing differently than other groups, and we're performing worse than other groups. And so that's the problem, inequality. And so when you break it down, there are different areas where we're unequal, or we're not performing equal. For example, one of the issues I talk about in my book, Black Culture Matters, is the illegitimacy rate. I think, for example, to take 1 year in 2018, 69% or nearly 70% of Black children were born to out of wedlock relationships, to unmarried mothers. By contrast, the percentage for white children was around 28%, Aaron. And for Asian children, 11%, right? And a number of studies from liberal authors and conservative authors show that when children are raised in single parent homes, they're at a much greater risk to suffer adverse results. And, you know, they're more likely to join gangs, for example. They're more likely to spend time watching TV instead of studying. They're more likely to have suspensions in schools and discipline problems, right? And so that's one of the problems, obviously. We also have a huge academic achievement gap that's persisted for decades with only slight narrowing. And the bottom line is, if the average African-American student graduating high school reads at the level of a white 13-year-old kid, you can't realistically expect them to have the same prospects in the job market. And likewise, if that same Black student performs math at the level of a white 12-year-old student in 6th or 7th grade, again, you can't expect them to have the same job opportunities. And so it's these differences in behaviors and performance that are leading to inequality. And just saying it's racism, it's systemic racism, is quite honestly, it's a cop-out because it doesn't get to the real issue. And if you really want to solve a problem, you have to focus on the issues and quantifiable, measurable facts so that you can analyze whether progress is being made or not.
Okay, so you want to, so that's fantastic. And I think when we're looking at the cause, I think, you know, the next question someone's going to have is, well, what's causing this? And I think this is where the issue is with most people. I think most social commentators, academics, people in the media, almost everyone can see in these communities, certainly in these Black inner city communities, you have, like you said, this education or this, you know, academic, you know, underperformance problem, the illegitimacy, crime. I think most people can see these, and I think most would agree that these are problems. But the question now is, well, what's the cause, or what should we focus on in order to help alleviate these issues? And I want to read a quote from your book and then maybe have you comment on that regarding this. Great. So you say, quote, this is from Black Culture Matters, quote, most notably, as a result of the unprecedented cultural and social revolution that occurred during the civil rights era, racism is no longer the decisive force it once was. Although it is certainly true that vestiges of discrimination persist, it is also clear that white supremacy is not depriving minorities of the opportunity to educate their children so that they can achieve success in the United States, unquote. So if you don't think if it's not racism that's causing this, or systemic racism or white supremacy, then what is the cause to these problems in your view?
Yeah, and that's a complex question. And quite honestly, it's a nuanced answer, right? Because there are going to be some circumstances where you can say, okay, for example, here was a racist teacher and they prevented this Black student from getting ahead, right? So I'm not ruling out that those kind of situations exist. But if you want to look at it from a global issue, it's pretty clear that minorities, Asian minorities, Indian minorities, Nigerian minorities, and African American minorities have wonderful opportunities today in the United States to educate yourselves. For example, I was just reading a book called Think Big by Dr. Ben Carson. And in it, he explained how when he was a 5th grade student, he was the quote unquote dumbest kid in the class, right? And he was the worst performing student in the class. He was grown up to, his mom was a single mother in Detroit or in Boston at some point, in a low income household. But we know today that he's been fabulously successful. So what made the difference? It wasn't somebody waving a magic wand and getting rid of systemic racism. No, it was his mother coming up with the solution that she didn't want him and his older brother to keep watching TV all the time. Instead, she gave them assignments. You have to go to the library. You have to read a certain number of books a week, and you have to write a report about it. Now, bless her heart, she might not have been able to read some of the books and understand the concepts, but she knew it was important to have her children read those books. And it dramatically transformed his life, right? And so those are the steps that people can take today in a country as gifted with resources as the United States to empower themselves and empower their children. So, racism, does it exist? Unfortunately, yes. But is it this insurmountable force that you cannot overcome through hard work and through the right work ethic and the right cultural values? Absolutely not. And so, I give you that as an example of why I argue that racism is not the problem. When I say that, I'm not saying it's not a problem, but I'm saying it's not the driving factor. Instead, we have to look at why more of us aren't taking steps to empower ourselves and to empower our communities. And when you look at that, unfortunately, certain mindsets have evolved over time. And I talk about in my book, for example, the idea that if you speak English articulately, you're quote unquote acting white. There are a lot of my liberal colleagues who've challenged that idea and say, oh no, that's a myth. But it's not a myth. I've lived through it. I've heard it, and countless other African Americans have heard the critique that you're acting white or you're an Oreo if you like reading, if you like studying. And by the way, that same problem has existed since like the 1950s. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar had to deal with the same issue when he was a child. So that's one example. Another example that's driving the academic achievement gap, because I think that's an important factor that we have to look at, is the fact that studies show that African American students spend a lot more time playing video games, listening to music, and watching TV than other students. And so it's not surprising that if you're behaving in that way, your academic achievement's going to be different. And by the way, you can't separate that from the fact that 70% of Black children are born to single mothers, because if you're in a household where your mother is either away at work and you don't have a second adult in the home to monitor your behavior, you're more likely to engage in these other behaviors. And I've seen it firsthand. If you have an overworked mother, she comes home, she'll give you the video games to play because, nobody's perfect, and being a parent is a hard job. And so all of these factors are interrelated. So you have to ask, why do our children spend more time playing video games than watching TV? Why do we have this mindset of, if you act a certain way, you're quote unquote acting white? And why do we have this mindset to this day that it's okay to have babies, daddies, and that's my baby mama out of marriage? And the bottom line is, Donald Trump or anybody else you want to claim as racist isn't forcing African Americans to continue to behave in this manner. We control our destinies, we control our behavior, and unfortunately, our culture has made certain behaviors normal and acceptable, and that's perpetuating the problem. And that's one of the things I try to attack and challenge in my book, because I want to see us get ahead. I don't want to see the status quo of inequality continue year after year after year.
Great. And you also say something that adds to this issue, something that exacerbates the problem, are well-meaning people, whether they be liberals or someone else, who engage in what you call a PC culture, where they don't want to focus on the issue. Or you also talk about this notion of that's harming the Black community, which is the notion of not wanting to blame the victim. And I think, I can hear people saying, well, it might not be the best thing. It might hurt maybe, the Black community's self-esteem, or, people of that community, if you always point out their issues and their problems. It's not the polite thing to do. What would you say in response to that?
Well, I mean, I fundamentally disagree with the idea that our people are, these fragile snowflakes who need to be coddled. I think that's a kind of subtle bias, right? It's another way of treating Black people differently, holding us to lower standards, and it's offensive, quite frankly. The reality is you don't get ahead in life by being soft. You don't get ahead in life by being fragile. And you can see it in the sports world, for example. Anybody who's read about Kobe Bryant or Michael Jordan, no, they weren't always fun to play with because they were tough and they would hold their teammates up to high standards. But that's what it takes to win. And that's what it takes to turn around when you turn around a team that has a losing record and a losing history. You have to be tough. You have to look in the mirror and be strong enough to confront your own weaknesses. And, I quote one of the former leaders of China in my book, Yang Xiaoping, who said, we have to acknowledge that our culture has been backwards in many ways so that we can move forward, right? And by the way, I can get why, white people might not want to be criticizing African Americans in light of the history. I can completely understand that. But that doesn't mean you have to go to the opposite end of the spectrum and negatively impact us with what I think was called the soft bigotry of low expectations and lower standards. I mean, they wouldn't treat their own children that way. Like, oh, it's okay, you got a D, that happens sometimes. No, they expect their own children to meet the highest standards. But a lot of times liberals want to lower standards for African Americans, even though that doesn't benefit African Americans in the long run. It might make them feel better about themselves, and it might accomplish other agendas that they have. For example, if African Americans remain dependent on affirmative action, that empowers the liberal elites because they're in the position of giving you something, right? Whereas if you're competing equally on the merits, now they're no longer in a position of power and you're no longer dependent on them. So yeah, I don't believe they're doing us any favors by coddling us or holding us to lower standards. And I certainly don't believe Black leaders are doing the community any favors by going along with that. We have to believe that we're just as capable and as talented as any other group, and we have to hold ourselves to the same standards.
So then my next question is, so we know that culture is the problem. And by culture here, you mean simply what? The behaviors and the mindsets and the ideals of this community? Is that right?
It's the behaviors, the mindsets, the perspectives that generate actions and behaviors in a way of thinking that actually undermines our ability to succeed at the highest levels.
Okay. And so what cultural values do you think need to be restored or that need to be inculcated for things to turn around?
So, there are a number of things, Aaron. One of the things that I'll start with, because it's a pet peeve of mine, is there's this mindset in our community that unfortunately holds that we're victims and that we can't really control our destiny. And you have very popular authors, left-wing authors like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who says, we're captured and there's nothing we can really do. And so it's this mindset that we're these helpless people, and that if we're ever to be delivered from our problems, it's going to have to come from white people or from the government, from Uncle Sam, or some other great emancipator. Like, one of the fundamental changes and reforms that we need in our culture is to adopt the mindset that we control our own destinies, that we're not victims, that we have the ability and the power to transform our lives and to transform our communities. And so we have to stop saying, for example, that, well, crime is affecting our communities because white people aren't giving us jobs, or our students are doing worse in school because white people aren't giving us more money. Like, we have to break out of that mindset that we're these perpetual helpless victims, because nobody gets ahead in life if you're waiting for other people to rescue you. It's an oxymoron. It's a contradiction. Yeah. You don't empower yourself by telling your people that you're victims and that other people have to rescue. So that's one of the changes. Obviously, going back to what I talked about, the huge illegitimacy rate in our community, I talk about it in my book. I mean, we're in an increasingly secular culture. For some people, that's a good thing. I don't necessarily see that way. But I think that one of the strengths of religion over historically is that it's given people a moral framework to avoid certain behaviors that are detrimental to a community. So, for example, when the Irish immigrants were facing high rates of prostitution and crime in the United States in the early 20th century, Catholic priests were able to kind of transform their mindset by getting them to re-embrace Catholic values of discipline, waiting till marriage to have children, avoiding too much alcohol, right? And so I think whether you do it through religion or otherwise, we need to find a way to start teaching our children that they're hurting themselves and they're hurting their children by having kids out of wedlock. And our culture needs to change the mindset that it's okay to be an unmarried baby mama or unmarried baby daddy. So that's another way we need to transform our culture. I talked about acting white. We need to banish that whole notion that says intellectual achievement and speaking English properly is in the domain of white people. We need to get rid of that. And so there are a host of things. I also talk about rap music, right? And how insidious it is, right? Like, if you look around the world, no group of people, except for African Americans, unfortunately, cranks out music that so consistently denigrates women and is so explicitly graphic and sexual, and it's sad that that's what's associated with our culture today. I think about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and some of the giants in our history, and how they would react if they actually heard this stuff. It's horrible. So we've got to reject.
I have a question about that.
Correct.
Yeah, just a quick question about that, because I think this is really interesting, and it comes up quite a bit, but then it gets dismissed also just as fast as it comes up. So you think the music and the rap music has this insidious effect on people? It really sort of encourages certain behavior, it glorifies certain behavior. Is that
I do. I think absolutely. I mean, there's no doubts about it that a lot of kids growing up listen to that music, form a framework or a perspective of viewing the world that is pathological, right? It glorifies pimps, for example. It glorifies street violence, right? And so, not surprisingly, a lot of people end up walking down the wrong path. It glorifies fast money, for example, getting money the easy, quick way, right? And so there's no way you can divorce, the fact that people have these rappers as role models, and then they end up emulating the behaviors that they see there, because by the way, I mean, rappers do make sense when they say, they're not making this up. These behaviors are also in the community, but it's a self-fulfilling prophecy and a spiral where, okay, these behaviors are in the community, we rap about it and glorify it, and so the problem keeps perpetuating itself. And then of course you have the whole mindset about women, being, I'm not going to use the words, but the B word, the H word,
sure,
and that
they're being objectified.
Yeah,
sure. And
so can you be surprised maybe that the rates of marriage in the Black community are lower than other rates, and that we have more problems having healthy marriages if you have a culture that's consistently denigrating and sexually objectifying its women? I mean, that's not surprising at all. So the problems are interrelated. And, you know, I definitely think it's sad that instead of acknowledging this, a lot of Black community leaders and so-called intellectuals have bent over backwards to try to justify rap music. It's, you know, what I call the perpetuation of pathology in our community.
Right. Now, how would you propose that we get these correct values, or at least we get this correct framework into the minds, into the hearts and minds of the community?
Sure, absolutely. You know, two of the big ways to try to affect, bring about the cultural reform that I call for in my book are through education and through institutions, community institutions, whether religious or otherwise, that focus on inculcating the right values in our youths. Because let's face it, our best hope for the future is to teach stronger values to our children, right? And so one of the things I talk about are whether you use charter schools or private schools in a way comparable to what the Jewish community has used with their day schools to inculcate certain values into children when they're young and they haven't already acquired some of the negative mindsets that we see all around us in too many inner city communities, right? So at school, you can focus on hard work, education, you know, thrift, discipline, impulse control, you know, the kind of values that are conducive to success in a capitalist society. You can also have community centers. You know, one of the things I admire in, you know, Asian immigrant communities and other immigrant communities is how they have cultural centers where their children can be sheltered from some of the negative exposures that are out there in the community, so that they can build a strong culture that values family, that values discipline, that values hard work. And we have the resources to do this, Aaron. You know, I think the mindset is we have to wait for other people to give us reparations or to give us more money. But we have the resources in our community to focus on our children and to strengthen our culture if we recognize what the problem is. As long as we're battling this invisible force known as systemic racism, we're not going to be targeting the behaviors that are driving inequality today, and that's a major problem.
Okay, well, that's great. And I think that's a really good point. I think, like you said, the resources are there. We've spent, you know, as a country, we've spent, you know, billions, if not trillions of dollars on trying to sort of work on these issues, and they've all been, quite frankly, a failure. And I think that's because people are looking at the wrong problem. So if you look at the wrong problems, then you're going to sort of craft the wrong solutions, and you know nothing's going to change. So I also want to ask, with the few minutes that we have left, I guess, and I think this is related to your book, but I certainly want to bring up what's been in the news, you know, for the past few months, a lot, and it's been in the news actually for years, ever since. Well, certainly it gained prominence since the Michael Brown killing in Ferguson, and that is Black Lives Matter. It seems like your approach seems to be the opposite of Black Lives Matter, because they're not focused on issues within the community necessarily. They're focused on these larger, what they call systemic problems that are affecting the Black inner city community. And one of their causes now is the cause of defunding the police. So I just wanted to get your quick thoughts on, what do you think of that organization? You know, what do you think of Black Lives Matter? And do you think that they'll be successful with their approach at advancing sort of inner city communities by focusing on, for instance, you know, defunding the police or other more global issues?
The reality is, I think Black Lives Matter is a cop-out. I mean, the slogan itself, on its face, is something I think reasonable people will agree with. Black Lives Matter, Asian Lives Matter, White Lives Matter. But what's happened is these activists are allowing themselves to be used as pawns by the people who are funding this movement, whose real goal isn't racial equality. Because if these people were really interested in racial equality, they'd be funneling that money into after school programs and charter schools that deliver better results and eliminating the academic achievement gap. Their goals, and some of them have stated it openly, involve communism and socialism, right? And fundamentally transforming and undermining US society. But the movement isn't for racial equality, so we shouldn't fool ourselves. That's just the slogan they're using. Just like in the 1900s, the communists used the talk of equality for workers and capitalists. That's just slogan, that's rhetoric. Their real goal is power and changing society. So, but in terms of the well-meaning activists who have rallied around Black Lives Matter, unfortunately, they're doubling down on a failed strategy. I mean, what we're seeing is just the perpetuation of what, activists like the Black Panthers were trying to do in the 1970s, and other activists have been doing since the 60s. The idea that, well, if we can just convince people to give more money to the Black community, things are going to transform. No, at the end of the day, the only path towards improvement involves hard work, right? And one of the things that liberals are skilled at doing is offering like the easy path, right? So we're going to lower standards. You don't have to score as high on the SAT. Or, we're going to not send you to jail for selling crack cocaine, right? They lower the standards. But that you never get ahead when people lower the standards. You don't see any championship football team that wins the Super Bowl because somebody lowered the standards for them. You don't see anyone winning the Nobel Prize because people lower the standards for them. Like if you want to succeed, you have to achieve at a high level. And to achieve at a high level, you have to meet the same standards as other people and exceed those standards. And Black Lives Matter activists don't get it. They want to avoid looking in the mirror and seeing, okay, these are problems in our community that we need to fix for ourselves. And they want to outsource blame for the problems onto other people with the naive expectation that other people are going to rescue us. Other people are going to emancipate us from poverty and from low academic scores. And that's just not the reality. So it's a destabilizing force in our society. They're being used as pawns by people who don't have racial equality as their lodestar, as their driving force. And it's a failed strategy. The only way we're going to achieve equality with other people is by hard work, performing at the same level that other people do academically, and reducing the crime rate in our community and the illegitimacy rate. When we behave equally to other groups, we'll have equality. Everything else is just a fake shortcut.
So I just find this really intriguing because I think that we do need a cultural shift. I think we do need a cultural kind of renaissance, so to speak. But I find it's almost, for me, I'm not quite sure how to address it. It seems like it's the chicken and the egg problem, because if teaching the adults of the community, as you said, it might be, I don't want to say it's too late, but it might be difficult to convince some of ideas that have already been entrenched. They've grown up with these ideas, and it's hard maybe to fully get them on board. And if you go in, and if you need the parents to maybe teach the children, I just don't know. Do you focus on the children? If so, how do you circumvent the parents, or do you focus on the parents? And if you focus on them, how can you, how can these ideas penetrate? I'm just curious if you have any ideas on how we can at least start the process. Like, where would you start?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Aaron. It's the $1 million question. And it is a chicken and egg phenomenon. How do you address these issues that have percolated for not just decades, but centuries? And how do you transform and reform our culture so that we can achieve equality with other groups? I think in one sense, you can draw inspiration from W.E.B. Du Bois and his notion of the talented 10th, and some people may say that's elitist, but the reality is if you look at any group of people, it's always the quote, and not necessarily economically the elite, but the people who are just more foresighted and more visionary than other people who lead the charge, right? And so you need to find a percentage of African Americans who realize that our issues are much bigger than just blaming systemic racism, that there are things we can do to strengthen ourselves and to improve our community. And so, and what we need to do is to have this group get together and come up with projects and ideas for how we can make tangible change in our communities. And so I talk about this in the last chapter of my book. You know, you can form, cultural centers and use these cultural centers as showcases in high crime communities to show that what we can do as a people when we focus our energies and talents on reducing crime and giving opportunity to the least fortunate children among us, right? And what would be nice to have happen is some of the more prominent members of our community, some of the more wealthy members of our community get behind this. I mean, and a lot of people are doing their own thing. You know, they might have their own schools or they might have their own centers, but you don't get ahead by doing when everybody's doing their own thing. You need something called synergy, people working together to accomplish goals. And so what we need to see is the most visionary members of our community getting together, focusing on how to change our behaviors and our mindsets that are detrimental to our goals of achieving equality in the 21st century. Create projects and institutions that aren't dependent on begging other people for support and assistance, that aren't dependent on looking for scapegoats for our problems, but are dependent on hard work and organization. And if we do that and a small group starts to have success, you know, people will see the success and they'll jump on the bandwagon. But we need some visionary leaders to step up to the plate and hopefully get some prominent celebrities or businessmen or athletes involved in the cause. And if we do that, we can dramatically transform our communities without.
Well, thank you so much, Nick. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Nick. This has been really insightful, and I'm just really happy that you could, take some time with me today to spread your message with my audience. So my final question is, where can people find you? Is there somewhere on social media that people can find your work?
Yeah, well, so the book is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, the ebook format. I definitely need to build my social media presence. I've tended to avoid that, but I do need to get out there, and I do have a Facebook account. People can look up Nick Pilgrim and find me. But I really invite anybody who reads my book to leave your comments on the Amazon page. I really enjoy reading your reviews. And I thank everybody out there who really wants to make a difference and get around the rhetoric of racism to actually try to solve the problem of inequality.
Well, great. Well, thanks so much, Nick. It's been a pleasure, and hopefully we can do it again soon.
Absolutely. Anytime. Thanks, Aaron.
Okay.